Do you need a microphone?
I don't know. Can y'all hear me? Don't need a microphone? If I start to get quiet, just especially in the back, just be like, go louder. Okay, awesome. So I don't think I need to introduce myself now. Thank you, honey. It's kind of fun to follow up Molly and Joey. I don't know if you know, Molly and I are sisters. We're bookends. I'm the oldest. She's the youngest. We've been married for 20 years in August. She's been married for like 2 months.
20 days.
Yeah. But that kind of works, right? For having Molly and Joey to talk about dating, because I haven't dated in like 23 years. So they're a little better at it than I guess we are. Thank you for handing those out. So today I brought visual aids for everybody. But before we take a look at those, I'm going to ask you to all stand up. This is a voluntary sharing of sort of medical information. So if you don't want to participate, sit down. But if you have broken one of the bones in your leg, sit down. If you have broken one of the bones in your arm or hand, sit down. If you have broken a toe, sit down. If you have broken a collarbone, sit down. If you have broken a bone I haven't mentioned, sit down. Oh, y'all are so safe. Wow. Okay.
Oh, no, we're not safe. We're just strong.
We're just strong. We drink lots of milk. Okay, so have a seat. Part of the reason why I gave you the visual aid is just in case we had a lot of people who hadn't broken bones. Good job, guys. If you take a look at, I know everyone's like, yeah, we're awesome. I'm pretty sure Chris has never broken a bone either. No, we thought he broke his foot. Remember the boot, the beginning of Sash? It wasn't broken. So if you take a look at the pictures here, this black and white image is kind of neat to take a look at. It's a picture of a broken leg. In the first picture, you can kind of see right where it snapped, right? See that nice break and snap in there? You can still see where it is 2 weeks later. You can still see where it is 6 weeks later, but then it looks like it's starting to heal, it's starting to go back together. 3 months later, you could probably stand on it. You can still see where it was broken, but it looks a lot better. But then take a look 1 year later and even 2 years later, you can still see where the break was. Now, 2 years later, do you think that that bone is hurting anymore? No. Do you think the person even thinks about it very often? No. Maybe every so often they might think, oh yeah, that time I broke my leg. That was fun. I used to hit my brother with the crutches. But 2 years later, 3 years later, 10 years later, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't affect everyday life. You remember the experience. But on an x-ray, even 10 years later, there would still be evidence of the break. And that's what this colored image is too. It's the same thing, only in a cartoon form. That's a physical wound. It's a physical hurt. The body got used to it. The body grew around it. The body still carries the evidence of that wound, but it no longer hurts the body. Now that's physical, but it is very much the same for emotional wounds. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I might go back to our physical, our broken leg visual to help us understand the idea of emotional wounds. On the back of your paper, you'll see some definitions. The first one that we all need to agree upon is what it means to heal. What is healing? Physically, we just saw a great picture of it. Emotionally, though, what is healing? It's integrating a new reality, a new normal, into everyday life in a way that doesn't provoke a dramatic or a violent emotional reaction. Does that make sense? Much like the broken bone, right? Emotional healing means we might carry around with us something that hurt, but it doesn't hurt us anymore. That's healing. An emotional wound. What's the definition of an emotional wound? It's the result of emotional pain that's become part of our interior life or our interior understanding of ourselves that causes us continued emotional pain, psychological pain, or provokes a reaction in us that interferes with our everyday life. That's an emotional wound, an unhealed emotional wound. Now, another definition we need to understand, and we're going to get to talking about this kind of in part 2 today, is emotional chastity, emotional virtue. How many of you have heard about just chastity? How many of you have sat through a chastity talk that kind of made you cringe? You're allowed to laugh. They make me cringe, right? It's like the virtue of thou shalt not. It's the buzzkill, right? Don't do this. Don't do this. Don't do this. Chastity makes life not fun, and you only need it until you're married, right? Thank you. No. Today, I'd like to present a different definition of chastity to you, but also a different idea. Because all too often, I think we're presented with the idea that chastity has to do with the outward. It's the outer appearance. Right down here at the bottom, that would be called our sensual attraction. It's physical. It's visual. It's out. But I would propose to you what John Paul II taught us. By the way, he's my favorite. I quote him randomly sometimes. Sorry, not sorry. John Paul II explained to us that chastity involves our whole person, body, mind, soul. And that because it involves our whole person, we need to understand that it's more than just a physical or an outward attraction or appearance, that it has a lot more to do with what's inside of us. And that's kind of where we're going today. We're going inside, interior life, talking about our emotions. Emotional chastity is a thing. It is a guarding of our hearts and our minds through the setting, typo there, through the setting of healthy emotional boundaries that can protect us from some emotional wounds and allows us to love fully. Chastity, the whole big picture of chastity, protects our ability to love. And it helps make us lovable. That doesn't sound like a buzzkill when you put it that way, does it? No. There was a pretty great definition I heard that I'm going to read to you. It said, chastity is the joyous affirmation. Well, that sounds really positive, right? The joyous affirmation of someone who knows how to live self-giving, free from any form of self-centered slavery. The chaste person is not self-centered, not involved in selfish relationships with other people. Chastity makes the personality harmonious, it matures, and it fills a person with inner peace. That sounds pretty great. How the heck do we do it? Well, I would suggest to you that it's almost impossible to be that integrated, full, harmoniously put together person if we are carrying around unhealed wounds. And it is impossible to have a healthy, self-giving relationship with someone else if we have not healed those wounds. Wow, Laura, that got dark really quickly. But let's take a look at that for a minute. On the whole, there are 3 different types of wounds, and I'm going to add a 4th that is more of a life experience, but it's still a wound, that we will encounter possibly during our lifetime. The first is what I would call a friend wound. And you know what? None of us are going to get through life unscathed by this one. It's the betrayal or the disappointment, that intense kind of FOMO, right? I don't want to be left out. It's being the object of gossip. It's being let down by people you thought were your friends, maybe even your closest friends. That hurts. That wounds us. Very often, when we experience this type of wound, we don't need an intervention such as therapy. But we do need some time to sit with ourselves, time to sort through the fact that this hurts, time to figure out what it means for us, what it means about that other person. We do some self-reflection. We eat too many potato chips. We eat ice cream. Maybe that's just me. But we need some time to integrate that reality. When we lose a friend, we have to get over that. We have to learn to live with that. We have to grow around that experience. That's healing. So a friend wound is something almost all of us are going to have to learn how to heal from and live with and grow from in our lives. Now, there's a deeper kind of wound. We call this one a family wound. You may have heard it referred to as a mother wound or a father wound, grandparent wound, sibling wound. We're going for family. It's a family wound. Oftentimes, these look like pressure to emotionally fulfill a parent or a grandparent or a sibling. It can look like emotional neglect. It can be manipulation, emotional manipulation, form of abuse, severe disillusionment with your family or severe disappointment, or the psychological effects of a divorce. These are all real wounds. And they very often require some help healing, help from a professional, from a therapist, from a counselor, at the very least from a trusted family member. These kind of wounds sit with us for a really long time. And if they are wounds that you received as a young child, they may go unhealed and misunderstood for a long time. And in my experience working with couples who get married, sometimes they don't resurface again until a couple is seeking marriage for themselves, wanting to start their own family. And then God says, hey, wait a minute. This thing right here, you need to heal this. You need me to help you heal this. Why? Well, just like our broken leg, if the broken leg doesn't heal, it's going to hurt that person until it does. And if you've ever hurt yourself, if you've ever broken a bone, or even if you've ever gotten let's say you got a paper cut. How many people have got a paper cut? They're awful, right? Especially if you get them in that soft part right here. And right, yes. You go to eat something, it drips and it burns. You cut a lemon, forget it. That's the end of the world, right? It actually changes the way you do things. It changes the way you eat your food. It changes the way you pick up an object. It affects daily life, right? Why? Because it's still an open wound. It hurts. When you bring an unhealed emotional wound into a relationship, whether you intend to or not, that relationship in some way becomes about that unhealed wound. And that is not a healthy or a sustainable foundation for a relationship. Not for a friendship, not for a dating relationship, certainly not for a marriage. That's why healing is so important. Because I don't think anyone here, right, would like to approach a potential spouse and be like, so, hey, I've got this unhealed part of myself right now, and that's what our relationship is going to be about. Are you in? The person should run in the other direction, right? No, major red flag. And yet, how often do we really do that? Because when we're not healed, when we have that emotional part of us that hasn't healed yet, in the back of our mind, we are subconsciously seeking healing. And all too often, we start looking to other people or other relationships to heal us. And guess what? It never works. And yet that's what happens. You know, Chris and I have been married for 20 years. It's not my job to heal him if he needed it. It's not his job to heal me if I needed it. It's his job to love me. It's his job to maybe even say to me, hey, Laura, I think you need to go get some help fixing this thing inside. That's love. If we were looking to each other to fill an emotional wound, to heal an emotional wound, we wouldn't be loving each other. We'd be using each other. And very often we end up doing that with our relationships. And that's what brings us right back to that idea of emotional chastity. And we'll get back to that again in a second. A third kind of wound that we can hopefully never experience, but you may, is a trauma wound. Trauma, the broad definition of trauma, is the reality or the perception of danger or harm to yourself or to someone or something like a pet that you care about. That's trauma. Real or perceived. That's the trick with trauma. Perception in this case is reality. A trauma wound can be inflicted emotionally even if you've gone through a physical trauma, a car accident, a house fire, something very, very scary, or something as awful as a form of abuse to yourself. Emotional, physical, sexual. A trauma wound inflicts deep emotional pain and almost always requires therapy to help you heal. And at the very least requires an evaluation by a professional to tell you if you don't need therapy. The fourth kind of wound that I'm going to consider a wound, but that is more or less a life experience that we will all deal with, is grief. Grief is the emotional reaction to a loss. Now, a loss can be the death of a loved one, the death of a pet, a change in your life circumstances, the loss of your sense of identity, a loss of a sense of stability. Children whose parents go through a divorce experience very deep grief, the loss of a family as they knew it. All of these types of losses cause grief. Grief by itself is actually healthy. We have to grieve loss. If we don't, if we try to suck it up and pretend we're not grieving, we end up hurting ourselves more. If we try to fake it and stuff it down, we repress it, it's gonna come out some other way, usually an unhealthy one. We can even run the risk of what we call complicating our grief, where grief gets really, really messy in our brains and our brains don't know what to do with it, so we end up experiencing anxiety and depression for a prolonged amount of time. Grief really stinks because while on the surface, most grief won't require something like therapy from a professional, if you don't allow yourself to grieve, you will. Grief, you heal by going through it. All four of these types of wounds are very real and stay with you. Healing them is what's important. Because like we said before, when we don't allow ourselves to heal, when we don't get the help we might need to heal, we bring them with us into every type of relationship we encounter thereafter. And unhealed, they become the focus or they become the foundation for that relationship. And then that's not good for us either. You know, every person every person is created with the desire to be known and understood and seen for who you are, accepted for who you are, and loved for who you are. Right? Those are good things. We're created that way. God made us that way. What happens when we're wounded, though, is very often that wound creates an idea in our mind that either I am not safe, I am not loved, I am not understood, I'm not seen, I can't be known for who I am. That's the effect of woundedness on us. And when that happens, the temptation is to start to look to other people to fill in that void, right? Because that's what we end up with. We end up with that void that wants to be filled up by being loved. That void that wants to be filled up by having somebody else notice us, accept us. And so a big risk that we run is starting to look at the other, for young men looking at women, for young women looking at the young men, and thinking maybe that person will make me feel whole. Maybe that person can make me feel filled up. I like how this person makes me feel. Right? I'm sure in some way we've all had that experience. Here's where it gets tricky. That, my friends, isn't a healthy way to start a friendship or a relationship either. Now, I'm not telling you should go hang out with people that make you feel terrible about yourself. Not what I'm saying. Yeah, oh, I love hanging out with her. She makes me feel like trash. No. What I'm saying is, when we start to look at other people to fill a need that we have, and when that need has been created by a wound, we aren't being fair to that other person. And we aren't being fair to ourselves. This is where the idea of emotional chastity comes into play. Just like physical chastity guards us and guards other people, sometimes from us, emotional chastity guards our emotions, guards our interior life. That's a good thing. Now, some of these wounds are wounds that may be inflicted on you despite having really strong boundaries, despite protecting yourself as best you can. And that's partly what makes them so traumatic. That's the case for a lot of family wounds that are sustained, especially when you're young, for any kind of trauma wound. But when it comes to those friend wounds, sometimes those friend wounds can run real deep, especially if it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Setting emotional boundaries for ourselves can protect us. That's a good thing. Just like we might set boundaries for physical behavior, we should be setting boundaries for our emotional behavior too. Why? Because we deserve that. You deserve that. You deserve to be known and loved and seen and understood and accepted for who you are, not for what you can do for someone else. Does that make sense? You see, our culture is very emotion heavy, right? Everything's about how I feel. Everything's about how he makes me feel, she makes me feel, what it makes me feel. And yet, that's not the basis for every healthy relationship. Are feelings important? Sure, God gave them to us. You know, when I meet with couples, I ask them this question. I'm going to ask it to you now. Is love primarily a feeling, or is it primarily a choice or a decision? Yeah. Call out to Father Fasano. Right. It's very interesting to me when I meet with a couple, and I'm not kidding you. Sometimes they will answer that question like this. Well, I feel like maybe it's a feeling because I feel like feelings are super important. Whoa, that was a lot of feeling. Love, and my answer to my couples is it's a trick question. It's usually the feelings that get you into the situation in the first place, right? Attraction is a good thing. Healthy attraction. God did that. That's okay. That's good. But at some point, our feelings can also lie to us, right? If I feel like every morning I want to eat a pizza and a Big Mac, pretty soon those feelings are going to end up with me being morbidly obese and really, really sick and also really broke. Sometimes my feelings are not something I should be consulting. When it comes to love and relationships and attraction, a feeling that we would say is love or falling in love, hearts and flowers and stars that circle around our heads like in the cartoons, that's not necessarily bad. God does that on purpose. But at some point, that feeling has to become a decision you make, a decision to want what's best for the other person. And so love ultimately becomes a choice that we make, sometimes over and over again. And guess what? You ever hear someone say, like, I fell out of love? Yes, no, maybe. I'm looking. I know y'all are tired.
Yes.
Thank you. There we go. What I think a better answer would be is I decided not to love. I fell out of love implies that you didn't have a choice or a decision in the whole thing. It just happened to you. Right? But over and over again, I can choose to love. Just like I can choose to guard myself, like I can choose to guard my feelings, guard my emotions, and to not impose my emotions on somebody else, my feelings on somebody else. I can choose to not use someone else for my own emotional fulfillment. That's actually love. Treating someone the way they deserve to be treated. That's loving. How would you define or give me an example of what it means to exercise emotional chastity within a relationship? I'm putting you on the spot, mostly because I'm waking you up and trying to freak you out enough so you don't fall asleep. Yes.
Keeping in mind like what conversations are going or what stage of the relationship.
That's a great answer. Oh, wait, yeah.
Maybe like the distance of the other is wanting to pursue something further than you can really would.
Yep. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Certain types of movies, shouldn't be watched.
Mhm.
In general, but also especially if you're a couple.
Yeah. All good answers. It kind of boils down to this one little sentence. It means treating your relationship however old it is. Does that make sense to you? Treat your relationship however old it is. I'll use Molly and Joey and me and Chris as an example, right? The relationship that Chris and I have now, being married for 20 years, looks different than what Molly and Joey's relationship looked like before they got married, in particular. Looks different than it did when Molly and Joey were dating. Why? Well, because as married people, we have a different level of emotional intimacy that we are allowed to and supposed to engage in with each other. But when we were dating, that wouldn't have been appropriate. When we were engaged, it wouldn't have been appropriate. When we were just friends and I was insisting that I would never marry him, that wouldn't have been appropriate. I lost that battle. You treat your relationship however old it is. And that means not just when you're together. That means when you're on your own too. This one can even be really, really difficult, I think especially for us girls, right? How many of you ladies have done that thing where you're like, you see some guy, the sensual attraction kicks in like, ooh, he's kind of cute, right? And the next thing you know, you're going home and you're planning your wedding, you're picking out your wedding flowers, and you are imagining him down the aisle and you're just walking down there with your dad, right? We do that. And yet, that's not appropriate. You know what, guys? I tried to think of an appropriate analogy for you guys, but my sons, who aren't here now, so I can call them out, are in my head. And the best I could come up with was like, imagine you see some girl and she's really, really pretty, and then all you can think is, man, I can't wait for her to make me a sandwich. And then I was like,
You got it in one. They're fired.
So yeah, I'm not telling you which one of my sons was in my head when I was thinking that, but it doesn't quite work.
Can we guess?
Not out loud. Right. Emotional chastity is something that we practice on our own even. It's guarding our imaginations. It's guarding our feelings to make sure we don't get emotionally attached to an idea of another person. Because we can do that too. It starts innocently, perhaps. You know what? When I am with so-and-so, there's something about that makes me feel good. I like the way he makes me feel. I like the way she makes me feel. I feel heard and validated and important. I like that. So now I want to be with them more. And now I'm going to make sure I spend more time with them. And now I am going to attach myself to them. And now I am going to emotionally and verbally vomit all over them because I need the way they make me feel, right? A horrible, disgusting term for that is emotional vampire. Yeah, right? Ew. Why do we do that? Well, because we have a part of ourself that needs healing. A part of ourself that needs to be filled up, not by that other person, but by healing and by a relationship with God, which is the ultimate relationship that we were created for. But what happens when we do that, when we form these emotional attachments to other people, we take that home with us. And even if we're all by ourselves, if we start thinking about that other person, we start thinking about how they make us feel. We start imagining a future with them that we are not capable of even starting in on yet, right? If I am 16 years old and I am thinking of what my marriage to this person is going to look like, that's not healthy. Why? Because as a 16-year-old, I'm not capable of getting married. So it means exercising a lot of self-control, emotional self-control, mental self-control, not letting our imaginations go where we can't follow. That's difficult. It's also not something people want to talk about necessarily. And yet, time and time again, we have the whole history of humanity to prove to us that very often, where our hearts go, where we attach our hearts, our bodies want to follow. So when you develop an emotional relationship with someone that goes beyond what's appropriate, that goes beyond what you are physically capable of sustaining, very often you run into physical temptations. I see this in marriage prep a lot. A lot of times, couples want to talk about the physical aspect of marriage. They want to talk about what happens on the wedding night, what they're allowed to engage in for the rest of their lives, without understanding that physical intimacy is supposed to be a fruit and an outflowing of the emotional intimacy that they are supposed to have as a couple. Very often, our society gets that reversed. We put so much emphasis on physical intimacy, we don't realize that as whole human beings and whole persons, we need to be tending to our emotional intimacy and our emotional well-being too. That the physical flows from that. But that's also why when you start to develop an emotional relationship with someone, emotional intimacy, particularly with those of the opposite sex, when you become emotionally attached, when you start relying on the way that person makes you feel, it becomes harder and harder to resist physical temptation because that's how we're made. So making sure that we are protecting ourselves emotionally, making sure we're setting emotional boundaries for ourselves is really important. I would argue that's what the beginning of where physical chastity is. It starts with the emotional. Now, very practically, what does this look like? Because I feel like we're talking up here and this sounds really great, but how do I do this? Because there's this guy and I think he's really cute. Now I don't know what to do, Laura. Or there's this girl and I think she's really cute and I'm thinking of that sandwich, right? So, good, you're still awake. There are some practical things you can keep in mind, right? The first would be to ask yourself a question. Am I ready to get married right now? If the answer is no, then there's no reason for you to be spending a lot of or any alone time with someone of the opposite sex to whom you are attracted. Wow, that was a big buzzkill. Hang on. Why? Well, because in those alone times, that's where we really start to build on that intimacy. That's where we share. It's where we have deep conversations. But those deep conversations where you are revealing your inner self, your hopes, your dreams, your thoughts, your fears, those secret parts of you that not everyone gets to know, not everyone gets to know them or that part of you till you are almost married to or married to that person. You are created to be known and understood and loved and seen, but not by everybody. That's supposed to be reserved for who God created you to become, either with another person or in another vocation. So, step one, if you are not ready to get married, don't spend a whole lot of time alone with someone to whom you are attracted. Groups, great. Together with families, great. But don't skip the steps. If I start acting like I'm ready to get married, but I'm not ready to get married, that's going to get really boring really quick. And y'all know what happens when we're bored, right? Nothing good. So we slow down on that. What else? Well, you start asking yourself, is this person potentially someone who could make me a better person? Is this someone who, down the road, right, when we're ready to get married, when I'm ready to get married, is this person a good fit? How do I know that? You take the advice of people you trust. You consult your parents. You consult other friends. Hopefully by now, when you reach that point where, okay, I am ready to entertain the idea of marriage, I am capable of marriage, then you take those next steps. Is this person someone marriageable? See, our culture, our society loves to rush things, right? And in some way, we're kind of made for it. We constantly have to put our own brakes on. You know, I have a 3-year-old nephew. He's quite the ladies' man. He, my parents, his grandparents, took him to the zoo, and they were looking at all the animals until he spotted 2 little girls around his age, and told my parents, "I think we need to follow them. I want to chase the chicks." My poor sister. Right? This same little guy, apparently, in his daycare, came home with a little cough, and he told my sister, "I have a cough because Emily has a cough and I kissed her." Right? It's innocent, right? But it kind of also speaks to a little bit of our human condition. We always want to rush things. How many of you have kids in your camps, right? 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we're boyfriend and girlfriend now." Yeah, pre-K, yeah. Right? Yeah.
Last year, a couple of kids were trying to get married.
Oh, see? There we go. It's written into us. We are made for community. We are made for relationship. The discipline comes into constantly putting our brakes on, ourselves first, other people next. Why do we do that? Because ultimately that's going to make us happier. Because ultimately it protects us from hurt. When we become too emotionally involved too quickly with someone, we set ourselves up to be hurt. We set ourselves up to be disappointed. We set ourselves up to be disillusioned because now this person that I imagined this whole fictitious fantasy future with, all of a sudden when they do something that proves to you they're human and flawed and not just living in your imagination, that disappointment comes and hits hard. And yet we've done it to ourselves. That's why practicing this idea, this virtue of emotional chastity is important, because it protects us ultimately. And then it protects the people we care about. Now, what am I not telling you? I'm not telling you, don't ever date. That wouldn't work either. Dating is important. It's how you figure out ultimately if someone is a person you should marry or not. But I'm going to say something maybe controversial. If you are not old enough to be married, then you shouldn't be dating. Not in the exclusive sense. Should you be forming friendships? Absolutely. Can you form close friendships with girls and guys? You can, but make sure you define what they are. See, that's something that comes up in marriage prep a lot too. I go through something with couples where we talk about the results that came from the National Marriage Project. It's a secular project out of the University of Virginia, and they study what makes marriages work and what makes marriages break. And one of the things that they discovered is that a major contributor to divorce and unhappiness in marriage is not having defined the relationship up until the marriage. The researchers ambiguously called it hookup culture, and they're kind of boomers, so I gave them like a little bit of leeway there because they didn't really define what that meant, ironically. But what they were getting at, right, is something you probably all heard. I used to talk to one of my family members before he got married and settled down. And I'd be like, "Oh, hey, how's it going?" And he'd say, "Oh, good. You know, I swiped this way or swiped this way, and now this girl and I are talking." Okay, what does that mean? And sometimes talking meant like talking, in-person talking. And sometimes it meant Snapchatting. And sometimes it meant being physically in each other's presence, but not doing a whole lot of talking, if you catch my drift. And other times it meant that they were actually like what I would call dating. But all of it was just talking. You see, that kind of ambiguity, without definition, without an understanding of what a relationship is, doesn't work. And the National Marriage Project actually said contributes to unhappiness and lower levels of commitment. So when you're forming friendships, When you are ready to begin seriously dating, set your boundaries. Make sure you both understand what it is you're doing, what your friendship is, what that means, what that looks like. Now, you don't have to be like super weird about it, right? Let's say you're old enough to and ready to start contemplating the idea of marriage, right? So you go out to eat, you meet at a restaurant with this person that you met and are on a date. First of all, make sure you both understand it's a date. That could get really awkward really quick otherwise. Do you have to bring a list with you and be like, okay, here are my boundaries. Are you ready? That might get kind of weird. Like, whoa, it's just a burger. But over time and relatively soon, yes, you should both understand what it is you're doing. Are we just getting together for fun because you think I'm cute and whatever? Well, that's not going to go anywhere. Or are you interested in getting to know me as a person? Because I'd like to get to know you as a person to see if we could begin a relationship that could go somewhere. That wasn't that hard, right? I just made that up. At this point in your lives, I don't know how old you all are. I'm 41. You all look young to me. But I would guess that not all of you are ready to contemplate the idea of marriage in the near future. What does dating look like for you? It looks a lot like, hey, yeah, I'm interested in you. Can we become better friends? Can we spend some time together? While we're spending time together, can I invite my best friend to come along? That's good. That's healthy. While you're doing that, while you're getting to know each other, still guard those interior parts of you. Those things deep inside that belong to you. Some of those hopes, some of those dreams, some of those fears, they don't get to be shared yet. Eventually, maybe, as you continue to define a relationship. But not yet. Then when you are ready to contemplate the idea of marriage, well, you articulate that. You check in with each other. There's a lot of communicating that goes on in a relationship. We're not really good at that anymore either. Molly and Joey talked a lot about that, I think, in their talk, right? Texting versus not texting. Don't obsess over an exclamation point versus a period. But there's a lot to be said for the importance of communication, the importance of definitions, and the importance of setting those emotional boundaries for yourselves. And then the importance of healing. Right now, if any one of those wounds that I mentioned really hit home for you, please don't be afraid to talk to your parents or a trusted adult if you feel like you can't talk to your parents about what healing looks like, about the steps that you might have to take to heal. Because that healing now is going to set you up for so much more happiness and success in the future, particularly in the area of the relationships you will enter into. So that's something you can all do right now. And if you don't need to heal from something that might require therapy or some additional intervention by a professional, we have a God who is literally called the healer. If you have one of those friend wounds that's just sitting wrong and you can't get over it, or I just can't bring myself to forgive this person, bring that to adoration. Throw it at him. Hey, you're the healer. I need you to heal this. See what he does. That's something you can all be working towards now. And then again, setting those boundaries, setting those emotional boundaries so you don't end up with more wounds that require more healing. I want to stop here and give you guys time for questions. Molly had told me that you guys had a great discussion after their talk. And so I want to give you the chance to give me some feedback, to hit me with some questions before you do go up to adoration. So I'm going to cut myself off there. Questions? Yes. Honestly, honesty is the best policy right there. And the way you just said it is perfect. I honestly don't know. You know, I probably, maybe I need to get to know you a little bit better. I don't know how I feel. Give me some time. That's all really good. Don't be ambiguous. The more ambiguous you are, the more you let people get up in their heads too, right? And lest anyone be on the other end of that, sitting here like, oh gosh, I got friend zoned again. I'm not telling you how many times I friend zoned Chris before we started dating. More questions? Yes, and then Lydia.
Like, obviously, like, not all of us are, like, ready for marriage or whatever, but, like, how would you practice emotional chastity in your marriage?
So, just like physical chastity looks different in a marriage, and in case no one has ever told you that before, yes, chastity is still important in marriage. It just looks differently. Emotional chastity in marriage means, as a spouse, there are certain intimate parts of myself, my interior life, that only Chris gets to know. If I start sharing deep emotional things, or I develop an emotional connection with another man who isn't my husband, I am essentially cheating. I am cheating, emotionally cheating on my husband. So even within a marriage, just like there can be physical cheating, there can be emotional cheating, emotional infidelity. And so husbands and wives have to keep that in mind, have to guard the friendships they have, particularly with people of the opposite sex. I would hazard to say it is virtually impossible to have a best friend of the opposite sex who isn't your spouse. You're setting yourself up for emotional infidelity. It's a good question. Thank you.
It reminded me of a video that Emily Wilson did about, I think that the title was like, the topic was like people asking her, oh, how do I know if this guy is the one? And she was like, if you're asking if the guy is the one and you haven't been gone on a date with him, you're asking the wrong question. She was like, you should be discerning whether or not you want to go on a date with him. And after you go on the date, then you discern, okay, do I want to go out again? And then from then on, it's like, okay, do we want to like become exclusive? And then you discern as you go. Like, you don't need to know whether or not you're gonna marry before you even date it. Because I feel like sometimes with like all the, if you go, it can swing like too far to the other side where it's like, you're like, oh, I don't want to date just anybody. And then it's like, oh, if I date him and I don't know if he's the one, then I'm like using him and wasting his time. It's like, no, it's not true.
Right. That's actually the purpose of dating. It's like, it's helping you discern. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. We skip from here to over there. More questions? Yes.
What would you say is the age that you are ready for marriage?
Honestly, it's different for everybody. There are a lot of factors that play into whether or not someone is ready to be married. My office is great evidence. I've had anywhere from 19-year-olds to 60-year-olds in my office preparing for marriage. I think the best way for me to answer that would be to outline the things that have to be in place for a person to start considering marriage. Number one being that you are at least canonically and legally old enough. If you're not, full stop. Hang on. But then making sure that you are emotionally mature enough. And sometimes emotional maturity can take a long time to achieve. Making sure that you have healed the parts of yourself that need to be healed. Making sure that you are reasonably financially capable of supporting yourself and another person. That's very practical, but it's necessary. And then making sure you've discerned that you believe you're called to marriage. If you're marrying because you're avoiding a vocation that you think you have a call to, then that's not going to work. So I'd say those things in particular kind of have to be in place first for you and the other person. Canonically, it's 16. However, it has to be with parental permission, I believe. And then the age of majority of the country is what canon law will say it will accept, which is 18 here. More questions?
What would you say like are the red flags of like someone like being emotionally chased to you, like for sharing too much information to you?
I think very often we have an internal thing that kind of like a little gut check that kind of pings us a little bit that we tend to talk back to, like, no, they just needed somebody to listen, right? How many times has that happened to you? Someone sort of really, really shares and you're thinking to yourself like, wow, that was a lot, or, ooh, that was really heavy. And then you tell yourself, but if you're telling yourself, but there you go. Now, there's one kind of caveat that I want to mention there. St. Francis de Sales tells us that it's important to have a friend, like a true friend, that deep sort of, I'm trying to get this person to heaven and they're trying to get me to heaven, virtuous friendship. When you have that with someone of the same sex as you, right? Girls have a best friend who's a girl, guys have a best friend who's a guy. There is a level of openness that you can have with this person that can help you sort of remain virtuous. You never kind of cross the line into like what spouses can share with each other. But for instance, I have a dear, dear best friend. And sometimes if I need advice, especially if it's advice about how to love my husband, I go to her, but only her. And she will go to me. We have what